Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into my cousin Moses and the Passover story explained. Let's get started. Welcome back to all of our longtime listeners, and welcome to our new listeners who may be hearing us for the first time. We are so proud to announce that this is the 150th episode that we've made for this podcast. Thank you all for your support, and I really can't think of anything more important to talk about for such an important podcast episode than my cousin Moses and the Passover story. In researching for this week's podcast, it was really funny to think that I actually haven't done a podcast about Passover in the 3 years that we've put out this podcast. I've done other holidays like Hanukkah and Purim, but I don't know how it is that I never did a Passover story. I do know that one time we put out a bonus episode earlier on in the podcast about different traditions of Passover found around the world, but this will be our first real deep dive into the Passover story. I'm sure for most of my listeners who happen to be Jewish or be friends with Jews know the story of Passover. Many people who are Christian know the story of Passover from various movies, their Old Testament readings. It's not really new to most of you, so I won't spend too much time giving you the very intricate details of the story you could find in the book of Exodus or Sefer Shemot if you're reading a Hebrew Bible. The book of Exodus is the story of the Jewish people in Egypt. They had come there because of a famine and various other things in the book of Genesis. At the end of Genesis, we see the Jewish people now in Egypt. While in Egypt, the Jewish people grew, as populations tend to do over time. And soon enough, the people who were in charge in Egypt when the Jewish people first got there were no longer in power, and the current government decided, we are not trusting these Jewish people. They are growing in numbers, and they could align with our enemies and be an enemy within. So they decide to deal craftily with the Jewish people and strip them of their rights and turn them into slaves. As many years pass and the Jewish people are still slaves and being treated worse and worse over time in Egypt, many Jewish people remembered the promise of God. God told their forefathers that they would be in the land of Israel. Why are they being treated this way? And how is God allowing this to happen? And this is when Moses comes in, my cousin. The reason I call Moses my cousin is because technically he was. Moses is said in the Torah to be a Levite from the tribe of Levi. My tribe is the tribe of Levi. So therefore, we are literally cousins. I've always found it very interesting that my family story is in a book that some or most of you all have read. It is kind of mind-blowing if you think about it, but I digress. My cousin Moses, the Levite, was born to a woman in the area of Goshen in Egypt, and according to the biblical text, the Pharaoh who feared the growing Jewish or Israelite population decided to tell two midwives, Egyptian women who would help the Jewish community when they needed help with birthing children, to kill the firstborn sons of all Hebrew or Israelite people in order to, I guess, control their population. Unfortunately for the Pharaoh, those two midwives didn't agree with him and allowed the Jewish boys to live, to the point where the Pharaoh then called them back and got so angry at them for not listening that he decided to make a decree that all Jewish boys will be thrown into the Nile and killed. And in a somewhat comical event, which we'll get to a little bit later, Moses' mother, after having Moses, her firstborn son, rather than throwing him into the Nile, literally, she did put him in the Nile, but she created a little basket, or an ark, it's sometimes called, to put him into the Nile so he wasn't killed. She technically followed the rules, and as many of you know from the story, Moses then goes down the river, followed by his sister, Miriam, who sees the Pharaoh's own daughter pick up the baby and nurse the baby, thinking that the gods of Egypt gave her a new baby boy to take care of. And in a final, ultimate laugh out loud moment, Moses' sister sees Pharaoh's daughter and says, I have a nurse for you if you need a wet nurse, someone who can give the baby some milk. Would you like me to get her?" And sure enough, that person who ends up nursing Moses is Moses' own mother. And she gets paid by the Pharaoh to take care of her own son, the one that was supposed to be killed by the Pharaoh's own decree. Of course, most of us know the rest of the story. Moses then grows up. He gives up his royal status in Egypt by saving a Jewish person's life and having to go into exile, then coming back to take on the Pharaoh and free the Jewish people. One really funny and amazing thing that I've heard about this story when I was doing my degree in biblical studies is the fact that this is known somewhat as a trickster tale. Now, for academics, that would suggest that whoever wrote it, not God specifically, was attempting to make fun of the Egyptians and the pharaohs. Others who take more of a literal stance that this was literally written by God and it actually happened, maybe could look at it as God playing tricks on Pharaoh, and Pharaoh being kind of too stupid to figure it out. In the trickster tale motif, you can see multiple times that Pharaoh is making decrees, and not only are people not listening to him, the women are undermining him at every step. You have these two midwives who are going against Pharaoh and helping Jewish women give birth, despite his decree. You have a Jewish woman putting her child literally into the Nile and undermining his decree. You have his own daughter taking care of a baby that was supposed to be killed, and ironically paying the woman who birthed that child to take care of her own baby. If you look at this as a, quote, trickster tale, you could see how ridiculous Pharaoh looks. God is playing games with Pharaoh and making him look stupid. He doesn't see any of this stuff under his own nose. Here you are dealing craftily with the Jews, and meanwhile, God is playing you for a fool. When you look at the story in this light, it is actually a pretty funny story. But if we skip ahead a little bit in the story to when Moses has grown up and is now taking control of the Jewish people through God, we often hear the term God's chosen people for the Jews. And we've talked about that on the podcast before, what it really means. Let's put that all aside. In the most literal sense, we see the story of Passover as God choosing the Jewish people to make that covenant. Soon we get to the whole 10 Commandments, God giving the 10 Commandments to the Jewish people. But really, it's interesting because sometimes we see chosen people not being that God chose the Jews, because he did that a long time ago with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. This is the first time the Jewish people are choosing God. We are choosing to accept the 10 Commandments, which we'll get to in a minute. If you ask a bunch of rabbis, ones who've studied the Midrash, these are ancient Jewish writings, they believe that maybe the time between God promising certain things to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the time that God came back to Egypt and brought the Jewish people out to give them the 10 Commandments, that God sort of shopped around the idea to all other nations in the world to see if they wanted to be or were able to be the chosen people. And it's only after realizing that no other nations want to be those chosen people and all of those responsibilities that that would require, that God came to the Jewish people and gave them the choice to be the chosen people, and they accepted. And this story comes directly from the Passover story and from the book of Exodus. The fact that the Jewish people received God's word directly from him. In an interesting thought by Rabbi Tovia Singer, a brilliant scholar on Judaism and the Torah, he points out something incredibly interesting. If we think about the story of Mount Sinai, when the Jewish people are all around this mountain waiting to get the 10 Commandments, he points out that this is likely the only people in the world that had a communal revelation. A communal revelation being the fact that the entire Jewish or Israelite community saw God himself and received God's word. If you think about most modern religions, many of them are based on a person's revelation, a solo revelation. For example, in Christianity, you have Paul, who received a revelation from Jesus and then started a religion called Christianity. In Islam, you have Muhammad, who received a personal revelation from the angel Gabriel. These are just two examples of most religions today that claim one person saw or spoke to either God or more likely someone else like Jesus or an angel, and that was how their religions began. whereas the Jewish people, the Israelite people, actually saw and heard from God himself at Mount Sinai. According to the book of Exodus, God warns Moses and says, "Tell the Israelite people that I will speak to them directly." And in Exodus 20, the Bible describes the exact moment that the Jewish people heard the voice of God. All of the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the blare of the horn and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. "You speak to us," they said to Moses, "and we will obey. Let's not let God speak to us, lest we might die." Moses answers to the people, "Be not afraid, for God has come only in order to test you, in order that the fear of God may be ever with you, so that you do not go astray." So the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. God says to Moses, "Thus shall you say to the Israelite people, you yourself saw that I spoke to you from the very heavens." The biblical account shows that the Jewish people did in fact see and hear God on Mount Sinai. And it was intended for the Jewish people to understand forever and all time that God is with them. And the Jewish people have never forgotten that. And part of the reason why Jewish people have never forgotten this is the fact that we have a Passover Seder every year. The Passover Seder was intended and is still used today to remind us of these moments in our history. In the Passover Seder, during the reading portion, it specifically says that every person during the Passover Seder is living as if they too were being taken out of Egypt by God. It is a reenactment. It is a reminder for Jewish people every year that our people did get pulled out of Egypt by God. We saw the hand of God and we heard his voice, and we cannot forget that. And this is why we relive and reenact the Passover every year. For the record, I'm not claiming to be an academic scholar on this specific issue or a rabbi giving you religious advice. I'm simply pointing out the fact that the Passover Seder is intended to remind every Jewish person who didn't hear and see God at that time, because it's many, many years ago, that we did pass these traditions down from the people who were there, and we can't forget it. So for those of you who might be a little less familiar with the Passover tradition, this sitting around a table and reading the story of Passover and reminding us of what our people went through, having to eat foods that symbolize the torture and pain and suffering of our people. And this leads me to a question that one of our followers had asked, which is, while you're doing the Passover Seder, what's the mood? What's the feeling? Is it anger? Is it frustration? Is it sadness? Is it joy? How does it feel to sit around and remember the kind of torture of your people in Egypt, and also the amazing power of God pulling us out of Egypt? What does it feel like? And it was a very interesting question because I've never really thought about it. At this point, it's just kind of habit and tradition doing it for so many years. But it is definitely very interesting to consider now. I think that there's a lot of joy and happiness in Passover, despite it being somewhat of a bleak holiday where our people were oppressed and were made slaves. But I guess we focus more on the bigger picture here, which is the fact that God heard our suffering and will always defend the Jewish people. And not only did he defend the Jewish people and bring us out of Egypt, but that's where he gave us the 10 commandments, and in theory, the 613 commandments, that the Jewish people today still follow. We agreed that was when the covenant was really created between the entire Jewish people, not just Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. This is where, for the first time, the entire Israelite community came together and agreed to be the chosen people, to take on these difficult tasks of 613 commandments. And we even heard God himself speak directly to us. It really is uplifting and inspiring and a good yearly reminder of why we're here and why we are Jews, why we still put up with the anti-Semitism and the hate. What is it all for? We could have easily just given up in Egypt, assimilated, but the Jewish people then never gave up. And we won't do that now either. It's a reminder to us to make sure that we hold on to what makes us special and what makes us unique, even at the worst of times, like it feels right now. And sadly, I hate to say that those people who no longer practice Passover, they don't have a Seder and they don't read these stories, they end up with Jewish Voices for Peace or other groups that have no idea about their own history. It is our job to relive and reenact the Passover story every year to ensure that this unbroken chain never breaks and our children know where we came from. In the end, I am very surprised that in 150 episodes, I have barely talked about Passover, even though it is one of the most important holidays. Every time that I sit down and I listen to the story of Passover and I read the books at the dinner table with family and friends, it reminds me of my people. And the funniest thing is that until recently, I really never took in the fact that I am reading the story of my cousin Moses, the Levite, who changed the world, according to many, who, thanks to God, took down a pharaoh of Egypt and brought the Jewish people to the land of Israel and gave the entire world the 10 Commandments. God has never forgotten about the Jewish people, and he is with us forever, no matter where we are, if we're in Egyptian slavery, if we were in our land of Israel, or if you were in the diaspora. But God is always with you. God is looking out for you. And every Passover, remember, he and you chose to be the chosen people. And that comes with a lot of responsibility and a lot of pride. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.